the only period like this one that we ever had before, which was called the go-go 1920s, the flapper era, when anything was possible. When you did it that way, when you repressed all left-wing, all labor movement activity that you could, is that you prepared the way for the biggest collapse this system has ever had. And in my humble opinion, that's exactly where we're going now.
Welcome back to Deep Focus. I'm John Kiriakou. Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill is the law of the land, whether we like it or not. It includes gigantic expenditures for DOD, gigantic expenditures for border security, or what we're calling border security, and cuts to things that people actually need to live, like Medicaid and food stamps and block grants. This is going to be a tough one. By all accounts, it's going to take states as long as a generation to recover from this, and that's if it turns around right now. We're going to talk about this very complicated issue today with Dr. Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs at the New School. He's the author of many, many books, the most recent of which is called Understanding Marxism. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. It's always such a treat for me and a pleasure to see you. Welcome back.
Well, that's very kind of you. I appreciate it, and I'm very glad to be back and talking with you.
Thank you very much. This big, beautiful bill. You know, the Republicans have the smallest majority in the House of Representatives in the history of the country. Right now, with a handful of deaths, there are a couple of open seats. It's a majority of 3. In the Senate, it's close. It's 53-47. There are a couple of gadflies. You're never sure if you're going to have to call in the vice president to break a tie. But this thing passed. And because there's a Senate rule that you cannot filibuster a budget bill, they attached everything they could attach to this budget bill, and it passed as the big, beautiful bill. How bad is this going to be for the deficit, the national debt, perhaps even inflation, most importantly, for working people or the working poor who actually need these government services to live? Can you walk us through what this thing means?
Sure. The first thing to say, and I don't mean in any way to soften the blow that I'm about to describe, but in many ways, this is a continuation of what the Republican Party and more broadly the conservative, business-dominated ideology of the United States has been for 75 years. I mean, the important thing for people to understand is that something remarkable happened in the 1930s that has shaped our society ever since. The Great Depression from 1929 to 41 is the defining moment of the economic history of the United States. I want to remind everyone that during that time, the working class of the United States went big time to the left politically. For those who live in the present and see that the working class is at best mixed in its attitudes towards the political system, there wasn't much disagreement in the 1930s that what we needed was something that would nowadays be called socialism of one kind or another. The president at the time, Roosevelt, didn't choose to use that term because it would have made what he was forced to do even more difficult. What he was forced to do was to recognize that the capitalist system wasn't working and that it needed major supports, even just to be tolerable to the mass of the American people. And remember, in 1929, you were only 12 years after the Soviet Revolution in Russia, and people had that in their minds. They knew what people could and would do if and when a system was no longer tolerable. Now, just to remind folks, so what happened? They passed bills that Americans can't even imagine today. In the midst of a depression, when the government has no money. Why not? Because millions of people are unemployed. And if you're unemployed, you don't earn an income. And if you don't earn an income, you don't pay an income tax. And if tens of thousands of businesses were bankrupt, which they were, they don't function and they don't pay taxes either. So the government had no money. It passed the Social Security system. For the first time in American history, if you're 65 years of age or older, the government is going to give you a check every month for the rest of your life. Wow, that's helping the average person big time. It means not just that elderly people have a decent retirement, but it means that their children don't have to scrimp and save to keep grandma and grandpa in a tolerable situation. So it helped everybody, the elderly, but their families, their children as well. No sooner was the ink dry on that bill than they passed the first minimum wage in this country. We had never had that before. No employer can pay less than a certain minimum because it's indecent to treat people that way. Then we had unemployment insurance. We had never had any of these things before. You lose your job through no fault of your own, which at that time meant tens of millions of Americans. We're going to give you a check every week for a year or two to help you through this difficulty. And then the biggest of all, the government became the employer of last resort. 15 million people who were unemployed, had no money, felt awful about it, got a job working in something the government thought was important. Some of our earliest ecological efforts were made then. You know,
Sure.
the WPA would
Hmm.
put art everywhere, theater and poetry everywhere. We did really wonderful things for the American people.
Yeah.
And here comes the best part. Who paid for all of this? The government couldn't. It didn't have any money. So Mr. Roosevelt, the president, who had been approached by the communists and the socialists and the big union movement of that time, the CIO, he understood if he disappointed these people, he wouldn't be the president much longer. So he went to the rich from which he came. He was a elite family in this country, and he went to the rich and he said, "You better give me the money to do all these things, because if you don't, we're going to have a revolution, and you're not going to have any money to give anybody at all." And that scared them. Half of them, only half, went with the president. The other half became what we later understood to be the John Birch Society and the basics of what MAGA is today. They are the ones who didn't go along. But Mr. Roosevelt had enough of them, together with a unified working class, and all those bills were passed. Now, why do I say it's a defining moment? Because everything since then, since 1945, when the war was over, when Roosevelt died, the business community was freaked out. Remember that in World War II, roughly 1941 or 2 to 1945, not only was all of this happening that I just described, but the United States was officially allied with the Soviet Union in the war against fascism. If you went to the post office in 1943 or 44 to pick up, say, a bunch of stamps for your mail, you would see over the clerk's window a picture of Uncle Sam arm in arm with somebody identified as Uncle Joe. And that stood for Joseph Stalin, who was celebrated alongside our president because they were the two big, powerful countries against the Japanese and German governments in World War II. So, what happened afterwards, and of which Mr. Trump is just a part, is the undoing of everything that happened in the 1930s, which was called, by the way, the New Deal. So think of the last 75 years as a program to reverse, to undo, stop taxing corporations and the rich, because that's how he got the money. He went to them and he said, "You got to give me your money. I'm going to tax you for half of it, and you can lend me the rest of it, and I'll pay you back someday, maybe." But the point was, everything after that had to be reversed. Stop taxing corporations and the rich. We've been doing nothing else for the last 75 years. Stop spending money to help the mass of people. That companies have been hesitant to do for fear of what it will do to the people. Mr. Trump is simply willing to go the next step. And so he brings in Elon Musk to do that savaging of our federal employee force under the completely fake notion that this has anything to do with efficiency. It doesn't. It's undoing the New Deal. The business community, and let me remind everyone, according to the United States Census, 3% of Americans are employers. The other 97% of us are not. But this is a program since 1945 designed, developed, and now imposed on us as the undoing of the New Deal. It has been developed over the 75 years and reaches its peak in that thing called Project 2025 that we heard about during the campaign when Mr. Trump said he didn't know what it was. Well, he is now carrying it out. I've read it step by step, point by point. If he didn't know what it was, then either he was not telling us the truth, could you imagine it, or he didn't want us to understand too clearly. But I'm here to tell you, as a professional economist, that's what this is all about. And if it's harsh, which it is, and if it's unfeeling, which it is, well, that's part of what we're talking about. We had to have nearly a total collapse of America before we got Social Security, unemployment compensation, a federal jobs program. And we're not going to get those things back again unless and until two things are likely. One, a collapse of this system, and or a mobilization of people who understand what's going on and have said and will act on the notion, that's it, we're not taking this one step further.
Let me ask you about that, because it looks like we are leading to the collapse of this system. In the 1950s, the highest tax bracket was something like 75, 80, 85% for the truly rich. And the structure of the tax system was such that it was generally based on a person's ability to pay. That is not the case today,
Right.
where in budget after budget after budget, we see tax cuts for the rich, tax cuts for corporations. That money has to come from somewhere eventually, or we lose what we've built over the last 75 or 85 years. Where are we headed now? There is no money for Medicaid. There is no money for block grants or for food stamps or for so many of the other things that we're doing. Certainly no money or no will for foreign aid, which actually would work to keep us out of future wars. What happens next when we just can't afford these things anymore because we've given the money all back to the wealthiest people in America?
Well, what the Great Depression showed us, which is one of the reasons I try to tell people and remind them of our own national history, what the 1930s showed us was that the only period like this one that we ever had before, which was called the go-go 1920s, the flapper era, the when anything was possible, when you did it that way, when you repressed all left-wing, all labor movement activity that you could, is that you prepared the way for the biggest collapse this system has ever had. And in my humble opinion, that's exactly where we're going now. And I think you're seeing the desperate, and I underscore the word desperate, the desperate acts of this president, because he is, on the one hand, the latest in the long undoing of the New Deal. But on the other hand, he's having to try to stave off the collapse of American capitalism. And the way he's doing it, for example, shows you the desperation. He declares economic war on the whole world. What kind of behavior is this? You will have to pay this tariff and you will have to pay that tariff. And we don't care whether you're Canada, which has been about as loyal an ally as any country could want for hundreds of years, or for that matter, Japan since the Second World War, or South Korea, or Mexico, and I could go on. You're savaging them. And only Americans who are lost in their understanding would imagine that you can hit out at all of these countries, taking away the economic dependence they've built up by supplying the American market with their products. You think that's going to happen? They're not going to be angry. They're not going to retaliate. They're not going to look to cut off their dependence on the United States because it's not a reliable market. Then I must say to you, in all respect, you're crazy. You are not facing the reality. I know the reality is troubling. You have every right to be troubled by it. But to turn your head away from it makes about as much sense as being told there's a tsunami coming and you're standing on the beach and you decide to look back and not at the water because you don't want to be troubled by that big wave. Jack, that's going to trouble you even more if you don't look at it and start running.
You
We've
know,
got to do things.
it seems to me too. I don't mean to smile because it's a very serious issue, but what you're saying is exactly true. And I was struck by one of the pieces on the front page of the Washington Post today that the president has decided to impose a 50% tariff on Brazil, not because the Brazilians are dumping steel or dumping rubber or whatever, but because he's angry that they are prosecuting former President Jair Bolsonaro for trying to overthrow the democratically elected government of Brazil. And on the one hand, I'm a third generation union member, so I get if unions want to see some tariffs on some kind to try to protect American businesses. You're in the steel industry, let's say, or you're an automaker. I get it, but tariffs just for the sake of punishing other countries because you don't like decisions that their leaders have taken, it might as well be a sanction. That's what it comes down to, and we all know that sanctions don't work.
Yeah, but it gives you a sign of desperation.
Yes.
And let me explain that. It's desperation because it always has the opposite effect of what you desire. Let me explain it with Mr. Trump's tariffs. He puts a tariff on virtually every country, which is in itself a hysterical act. It's a little bit like having Elon Musk go in and cut every government program. If you're interested in efficiency, you study each program and you make cuts if that's what you want to do, according to some general notion of what each agency does and how well it does. But across the board, firing everybody, that shows that what you're interested in is not spending money in these areas, not in the efficiency with which the money. Calling it efficiency is designed to give cover to the people who don't want to pay taxes and don't want that money to go out because then they won't have to pay tax. I can't think beyond that, and that's simple-minded because if you pay a tax and the government does something, you get the benefit of what the government does. You pay the price of paying the tax. You weigh both those things. You don't just go to either spend more or to tax more. I mean, it's childish. But let me get back to why Mr. Trump is desperate. Every country now has a tariff against it or is being threatened by it. You know what that does? It gives every leader, good leaders, bad leaders, and everything in between, an out, a wonderful opportunity. Things are going bad in Nigeria or Malaysia or Panama or, Poland. You can blame Mr. Trump, whoever you are. The tariff has really hurt. You get out of having being any way accountable. All Mr. Trump is doing is strengthening the position of every government in power because they can now plausibly blame Mr. Trump. So, and you know what that teaches the people of every country? that the United States is their enemy. This is not good. This may be great for Mr. Trump, MAGA, and American elections. But if you have even a little bit of understanding, the United States is now, and by the way, polls already show it, is considered the world's greatest threat to peace, is considered the most dangerous economy in the world, and is considered, and I love this phrase, a rogue state, because it's sort of out of control. The leader keeps threatening everybody, acting as if he can carry a big stick with no consequences. I can assure you, even the governments that you think of as allies of the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Mexico, their number one priority now is to get out from under the threat of the United States. They're cutting deals with one another to that end. They're cutting the United States out because they don't want to be in a position where Mr. Trump can close the U.S. market to them or block them from buying something that America produces that they otherwise would buy and want. And if you think that's not going to hurt our economy, then you don't understand. We are more dependent on the world than we have ever been since we were a colony of Great Britain. To cut ourselves off now, whoa, way too late.
Oh, well, one of the things that Donald Trump said this past week was that he's demanding that American cars be made in America. But we all know that that's not possible. As much as 40% of the parts come from either Canada or Mexico. And so there just won't be any parts. We'll have these shells of cars. Is it realistic for us to move in the direction of a truly American made car, or was it red meat for the MAGA base?
It's mostly red meat for the MAGA base, and you might add red meat for the gullible. If you half want to believe in all of this mumbo jumbo, well, then he's giving you that kind of shallow argument, which you mustn't look at. Let me explain again briefly why this is crazy. If you brought the cars back to being produced in the United States, you would have to pay the tariffs on all those imported parts, or you'd have to develop the machinery to make them here. And then if you did all that, you'd have to pay American level wages to the workers in the auto factories and the workers in all those parts factories. But that would raise the price of your automobile many, many, many dollars above what it is now. And you know what that means? It means every American company that is competing with companies around the world would be disadvantaged because it would have to pay for cars and trucks a much higher price than their competitor in England or Italy or Nigeria or Brazil has to pay. And we already have that now. I'll give you an example. The electric car and truck. Starting 15 years ago, there was a competition among all the car companies who's going to develop the new generation of cars that don't burn fossil fuel but run on electricity. I mean, basically, a battery. Okay, here we are 15 years after that competition started, and I can announce, as the whole world knows, the results. The number one success there is the Chinese, as is happening in every other area sooner or later. That's what it means to understand that the American empire is declining.
That BYD is a gorgeous car, and I would buy one if I was able to.
Right. Well, a few weeks ago, I was in Europe, to be particular in Paris, France. And all over the streets, parked and moving around, were BYD automobiles. Why? Because they're the best, cheapest electric car on the market. Same thing with the truck. Every capitalist around the world who needs cars or trucks for their business as an input is buying BYD cars because they are the best quality and the lowest price. Americans can't compete. Why? Because they can't get access to the BYD. And why is that? Is BYD unwilling to sell cars in the United States? Absolutely not. They have offered to do so. They are eager to add the US market to the markets they already have in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe.
Number
But
one selling car in Australia.
right, and Mr. Trump in his first presidency imposed a 27.5% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. But now, to show you that this is not about Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden raised the tariff on BYD from 27.5% to 100%. Let me explain. If the car or the truck costs $30,000, and that's what they basically do, you would have to come up here if you're an American with 30,000 that go to China to pay for the truck, and another 30,000, 100%, go to Uncle Sam because you're paying the tariff. For you, the truck would cost 60 grand. So you don't buy it. You buy a lower quality electric vehicle from Ford or General Motors or Tesla. You pay $50,000 to $60,000 for it, and you buy that because that's the best you can do. But it puts you way behind your competitor around the world. So when we cut ourselves off, we are handing the competitors of the United States the ticket to defeat the Americans they compete with. And you know what that jeopardizes? U.S. jobs. So when Mr. Trump says, I'm protecting U.S. jobs, no, he's not.
No,
He's
he's
enacting
costing them.
a kind of ideological game. He's appealing to the people who don't understand. He only tells them the part that's the good news, not the bad news. And so he can mobilize the American people in what we will one day all remember as an act of consistent self-destruction. Good for Mr. Trump, good for his election victory, happy news for the MAGA faithful, but for the American economy, in whose name it's done, it's a disaster.
Richard, I'd like to ask you about BRICS and the possibility of a unified currency. But I want to lead up to that by saying that when I was in Hong Kong a year ago, I had trouble using my credit card. Most places didn't take a Visa or a MasterCard, but they took this thing called an octopus card. I had misidentified it recently as a Panda card. It was the octopus card. And I asked one of the shopkeepers, what is this octopus card that I see everywhere that people are using, Chinese people? Yeah, that's the credit card. That's the Chinese credit card. I said, well, why not just use MasterCard and Visa like everybody else does? Because I'm an idiot sometimes. And the shopkeeper said, because every one of those transactions goes through New York, and these go through Shanghai. And so if the Americans decide to shut us off or impose sanctions, rather than to cripple our economy, it doesn't harm us in any way. Is that the future, or is that something that's just specific to China right now? And should Wall Street be worried about this independence that the Chinese are showing on financial matters?
The few that pay attention are worried. So I can answer your question that way. But they remain a minority. And even they are hesitant to do much, both because they don't want Mr. Trump to turn against them, because he's very vindictive and he has no boundaries and he will denounce them and all that. But even more, they're getting from Mr. Trump enough in the way of short-term gains that they don't want to, interfere with the goose that's laying golden eggs for them. I'll give you an example. 10 days ago, we had that bill go through Congress, signed by the president, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which gives corporations incredible tax cuts. It continues the tax cuts Trump gave them back in December of 2017. They're getting lots of really tangible billion-dollar goodies. So, yes, they are worried. The long-term implication, basically, by the way, the Chinese credit card is part of the fact that China is years ahead of the United States in utilizing electronic mechanisms of payment. With that omnibus or octopus, whatever you want to call it, everything they pay, everything, and every bill they have, every fee they have to pay, their taxes, all of that is now done instantaneously by credit card. You get a monthly statement that goes through all of whatever it is you've done. And that's there for legal purposes. It's as if you had a personal accountant keeping track of everything you're doing. Only now you don't need to pay anybody. It's built in to the credit card. And if you don't like that, of course, you tell yourself stories about how the government can now peek in on what you're doing. But the government can get the records of your MasterCard, and they can get the records of your telephone, and they can get it's just more inefficient when our government does it. Otherwise, there's no significant difference. Let me turn to the BRICS because it's very, very important. They just had their summit meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil over the last week or so. And I need to explain to people that reality, the BRICS, the whatever it is now, I think 8 or 9 member countries and another dozen or so partner countries that are on their way to becoming member countries. It started off, the very word BRICS is an anagram: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's what BRICS stands for. And then a bunch of countries have joined since. If you want to understand what it means, let me give you 2 statistics. I'm an economist. That's what we do. We play with statistics the way little children play with toys. And it is, let me assure you, a toy. The population of the United States, 330 million, works out to 4.5% of the world's people. If you put together the United States with its major allies, the so-called Group of Seven or G7, it's the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. What was the core of the world economy for the last 75 years. You add up their populations and you come up with, I don't know, 15, 16% of the world's people. Now let me turn to the BRICS. You add them all up, it's over half the people of this planet. No contest. They are large and we are small. Let me give you the second statistic. In economics, we have a rough measure of the size of an economy. It's called the GDP, Gross Domestic Product. And every country and the UN and so keep track of that. Okay, if you add up the gross domestic product of the G7, that's the United States and its major allies, it works out to about 28% of the total output of this planet that we live on here, Earth. If you do the same, you add up the GDP of the BRICS alliance, it's 35% of the world's output. In other words, the United States and its allies, who were from 1945 to around 2010, 12, 15, the dominant economic powerhouse. And what does that mean? It means when every country, any country in Asia, Africa, or Latin America needed help in one way or another, they would send a mission to New York or Washington or London, and they would hope to get this and so forth. And they have pitch people go and explain why that would be helpful and so forth. Nowadays, They do that. They send a mission to New York and London, but that mission doesn't go back to its African country of origin or its Latin American country. They go directly from Washington and London to Beijing and New Delhi and
Right.
Sao Paulo. And they
Yes.
make the same pitch there.
And they're
And
more
they,
likely to receive a fair hearing of that
yeah,
pitch in
yes.
those
Not only that,
countries.
because they're dealing with the richer of the two options.
Hmm.
And they're going to therefore get, not every time, but most of the time, a better offer. That's why they go. And the Chinese, who are the major player here, are the ones who say, yes, we'll build a railroad and we'll do it for this amount of money less than what the Americans or the British or the French or the Germans offered you. And so, by the way, the railroads of Africa are currently being built by China. And China is making all the inroads that go with all of that. This is a changed world. Let me assure you and your audience, every country in the world, and more than that, every large corporation doing business across boundaries of countries is readjusting its investment plans, its calculations, its strategic decisions to take account of the fact that the world economy is now dominated by something other than the United States and Western Europe, or add Canada or Japan. And you're not going to change that. You're not going to stop that any more than you could. The British Empire tried to stop the Americans from having their empire. You know, on the 4th of July, a few days ago, we celebrated the war that separated the United States from the British Empire. And then in 1812, we had another war, same issue. After that, the British gave up. They couldn't do it. And the United States rode. The British tried. Even in the middle of the Civil War, they toyed with taking the side of the South against the North. But it was too late. They didn't want the United States to flourish, but it did. Today, Mr. Trump doesn't want the Chinese to flourish. Americans haven't wanted them for many years. It doesn't work. It never has. And I don't even want to raise the question of what does it mean the United States playing as its major role in the world, holding back the economic development of the world. Wow. You really want to be in that position? You really want a generation of people around the world understanding what your government is trying to do? This is taking short sightedness to a whole new level.
Richard, one of the things that seems to have the U.S. panicked is Brazilian support for the Chinese idea that the BRICS countries should eventually come up with a unified currency akin to what the members of the European Union are using, the euro. This would presumably dethrone the US dollar as the international, business currency. Already we've seen, for example, the Chinese buy oil from Kuwait using yuan rather than using American dollars. How big of a threat do you think a unified BRICS currency would be to US economic hegemony?
Very significant if they can do it. At this point, the dollar has already lost over the last 30 years a good bit of its international importance. I mean, if you look today at the proportion of reserves held in the central banks of 180 countries across the world, it used to be 70, 80% of their reserves, the backing for their currency, was US dollar holdings. Today, that number is more around 40 to 50%. So they've already voted with their feet. You know, the United States is also the world's greatest debtor country. We owe more to the rest of the world than any other country does. And our two biggest creditor countries are Japan and China. For those of you who are wondering about the Chinese potential, try to think what it means that the United States is the world's largest debtor and the second most important creditor of the United States is the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping, and if you're a debtor, you have to pay interest. So the United States has to pay interest to China because it owes China currently in the neighborhood of $750 billion. Gee, at say 4%, that means the United States government has to pay a 4% interest on $750 billion. That's about $35 billion a year that Uncle Sam collects from you and me, doesn't use it for our military, doesn't use it to build roads or to help our hospitals or finance our kids' college education. No, it takes that 35 billion and sends it in a big fat envelope to the People's Republic of China, who can and does use it to build their roads and their schools and their military. And if you didn't know that, that's because you live in a country that can't handle the truth of its own economic system. It can't tell its people what's going on in a fair and balanced way. Our culture is corrupted above all by advertising. Remember what the advertiser's job is, to tell you everything good about whoever the client of the advertiser is, and to hide from you everything that's bad. That makes communication the equivalent of lying. We live in a country where people, particularly politicians, think of themselves as marketing themselves to the public. Tell them everything good you can imagine and hide from them everything that might upset them. What that produces is the lunacy
Yeah.
we are now living through.
Last question for you. Yesterday, the White House imposed new sanctions on Russia. And there's this ongoing joke, like how many sanctions could there still be that we can come up with to impose on Russia and any other country? At the same time, it's clear from Iran's relationship with the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and many Western European countries that American sanctions just no longer affect the Iranians. They lack for nothing. Of course, it would be nice if they could, for example, purchase American spare parts for their aged Boeing 727s. It would be nice if they could purchase American dredging equipment so that it would be easier to get their oil out. But they don't really need the United States. Their trade relationships with the rest of the world are robust. It looks that like the Russians are in the same situation where the sanctions may have stung momentarily at the start of the war with Ukraine, but they've passed this point. What should we think about sanctions right now? Are we in what really should be a post-sanction era where sanctions just simply don't work if the point is to coerce another country into doing something we want?
Well, they never worked with Russia and China, who have been the most sanctioned. Even when the word sanction wasn't used, they were subjected to all kinds of discrimination, let's call them that. And those discriminations were hurtful to them. That's true. Irritated them. That's true. They want them lifted. That's true. And they had costs attached to them that they had to bear. All of that is true. But here comes the non-advertising mentality. That's one side of the ledger. What the damage is that sanctions can do. But here's the other side of the ledger. People who are affected, businesses, individuals, politicians, by sanctions, immediately go to work to get around the sanctions. The sanctions are a problem. If you're a businessman or woman, you know that problems in your business arise all the time, sometimes from places you understand and you anticipated, but often from places you had not thought were a problem, and then they become a problem. And that's part of what it means to run a business. You're constantly having to recognize and cope with problems. All that sanctions ever did was represent a problem. So, for example, if Russia wants to sell oil uh, to a country, and the United States threatens that country with consequences if they buy the oil, all right, now let's see. One option, send the oil to a third country, take it out of one ship, put it in another ship, and then the oil is registered as coming to the country in question from some third country that has no problem with the United States for now, right? If the United States figure this out and then applies the sanction to the next country, they keep going to another country. Every time they do that, there are costs involved. It's a pain in the neck. You have to, bribe officials. You have to pay extra storage costs. They don't want it, but they know how to get around it. And the oil is a basic necessity, so they're going to do it. Here's a second. You come up with a way of disguising it. That it looks like it's a ship full of grain. It isn't. It's got a layer of grain, and underneath it is the oil. I could go on and on. There's a catalog of them, but there's lots of literature, articles, and books that are available to anyone who seriously wants to understand this, to let them know that sanctions have a very hard time ever having the effect that they're supposed to have. The United States has completely embargoed Cuba, right? Since 1961. That's more than half a century. Has it overthrown the Castro government? No, it hasn't. Did it succeed, therefore? No, it didn't. One of the most recent countries to join the BRICS, you guessed it, Cuba. Right? So there's lots of examples where they don't work, but it's worse. One of the things that the sanctions teach is what that merchant told you in Hong Kong. You want to get out from the risk of a United States either under Trump or under God knows who comes after Trump, who might decide to use this or that economic weapon. The way to handle that is to cut the United States out of your international transactions. If you have a choice between selling whatever your country produces to the United States, or maybe instead to Europe, or sell it to the other one, don't sell it to the United States. Even sell it at a bit lower price, because that will come back to bless you, because the Americans can't do anything, and these other people aren't behaving that way. And until others do, you're going to. And now here's the biggest one of all. The country that was most discriminated against since 1945 is China, because they had a successful communist revolution. It took power in 1949, and the United States didn't recognize them until 1971. When Kissinger and Nixon went to China. So, no trade happened with them. They were not eligible for any kind of assistance. The United States blocked them at every point. And the irony, China is the greatest success story of the last half century. Shutting them down, making them become reliant on themselves without access to Western technology, Western finance, Western markets, was the best thing that happened. I'm exaggerating, but you're getting the point. They were able to turn inward and to develop an economy which now is the greatest competitor the United States has ever had. and is beating them at more things than it's not beating them, so that when it's not beating them, you always have to add the word yet, because they're doing it in AI, they're doing it in electric vehicles, they're doing it across the board. So it turns out that the mother of all sanctions imposed on them for the longest time produced the greatest competitor we had. It's in that sense that I'm trying to get across that the policies pursued have been one immense failure. They may have given the United States empire a few more decades before it passes from the scene, but it hasn't stopped the process. It hasn't reversed the process, and it shows absolutely no sign of being able to do that in the future.
Amen. Richard, you have written a lot of books. What are you working on right now?
Well, the most recent book is called Understanding Capitalism, and here's what it's about. I do this weekly show called Economic Update. So it's all over the country, radio, YouTube, all of that. And in it, I do these small segments trying to answer questions like those you've just posed to me now. And I do that. And what I get is emails, lots and lots of them. And over the years, I've condensed what those emails are asking me to do. They're asking me to go into these things I do, these short summaries, in more detail to work it. They want, which is great. I'm very happy that that's what I want. I want you to hear something, get interested in it, and then teach yourself, learn more about it. But they've wanted me to do it. I can't really do it in a half hour, once a week format. That doesn't work. So I wrote a book, and I tell people, if you want to get more of what I do, get a hold of this book. It's called Understanding Capitalism. It's not very long, and it's written for anybody who wants to understand these sorts of things and has a little time. A little time to read and get into it. That's what the book is for.
Fantastic. Well, Professor Richard Wolff, always a delight. Thanks again for joining us and for educating us. Good to have you.
Thank you very much, John, and my appreciation to folks like you, because these are the programs with which all of this can be changed.
I hope
Just
so.
have to get a big enough audience, and you're doing that, and so I'm grateful to you for that.
Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, please do us a favor of hitting the subscribe and the like button. It really means a lot to us. That's the way we can keep these things going. So we appreciate you doing that. Thanks again, Richard. So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.